Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we speak openly about what it really takes to connect people at work. From internal comms and knowledge sharing to the messiness of change and the rise of AI, we go beyond best practices to unpack what's working, what's not, and what's worth rethinking. Our host, Bourgeault-Trickey, has spent over 10 years in internal comms, building and launching intranets for organizations in telecoms and finance. He now leads client services at Happeo, where he's helped over 120 businesses across the globe create and grow engaging digital workplaces that drive organizational goals and objectives. If you care about how people in your organization share, learn, and adapt, this is your show. And if you're looking for a modern digital HQ, you can find us at happeo.com.
Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we explore the messy, brilliant, and occasionally unfiltered world of internal comms, knowledge sharing, and digital transformation. I'm your host and Happeo's Principal of Client Services, Bourgeault-Trickey. Today's guest is Maliha Aqeel, a globally recognized communications leader and award-winning strategist known for shaping brand narratives that drive real business impact. She's led major transformation initiatives across industries and is admired for her ability to blend creativity with measurable results. I'm thrilled to have her on the show to share her insights from her latest work with us. Thanks for joining.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So just want to kick off with our icebreaker as we do. And so the question I had for you was, if internal comms had a blooper reel, what would be on yours?
Mine is actually, it was less of an internal comms blooper reel. It was more when I was doing PR. I'd received tracked edits from a client on a press release. And instead of doing like the traditional tracked edits in Word, they just wrote it down inside using a different color ink. And I accidentally sent the press release with the client's internal notes to the media. And they actually published it with those internal notes.
Mm.
And the client calls me. They were like, why does the story have these words? And I was like, I have no idea. And inside, I am like sweating. And I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? It was just one of those things where nowadays, whenever I'm attaching anything, like I will always open the attachment like 10 times to make sure that I've attached the right one and there's no lingering notes left in there. But this was like such a long time ago, but it always sticks with me because it just reiterated to me how important it is to just double check your work before it goes out. But I'm so surprised that the newspaper, the national newspaper, and they didn't even check. They were just like, yeah, we're just going to post this copy as it is. And they didn't use the whole press release, just the first paragraph or so. And that's where the notes were.
Wow.
It was just one of those things. I laugh at it now, but at that point, I was like, "Oh my God, am I going to get fired for this?"
Yeah, that's crazy. Holy moly. Yeah, I can only imagine. I guess, maybe change your relationship a little bit with the newspaper as well. But,
Yeah, it did make me wonder about their editing team.
yeah, no, for sure. That's crazy. Well, okay. So moving on from there, we wanted to kind of maybe talk a little bit about like setting the scene, motivation, that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to start like, what's one communication strategy that companies get wrong most often, and how do you get them to rethink it?
One of the biggest ones is thinking that technology will fix a communications problem. And I think what I've always seen is if you stick to the tried and true principles of communication, then you're in good hands. If you're and a lot of those things are understanding your audience, understanding exactly the purpose or the why of why we're communicating. What does this mean for the business, and in internal comms in particular, what does this mean for the everyday of your employees? And if you can keep those in mind, then any kind of strategy, no matter what the initiative is, will be successful. If your entire thing is we will send out an email and it'll be fine, or let's launch a company Slack channel and it'll be fine, those are just, they're not necessarily going to fix the root cause of an issue. There literally are tactics, and unfortunately I've seen some communication professionals who when they're in those strategy meetings with their executive teams, they automatically start jumping into those tactics, and they're not necessarily stepping back and saying, okay, how do we connect what the executive would like to achieve with what we know about our company culture and how our employees like to be communicated to. They start automatically thinking, yes, we can send out an email, or let's post it on our Teams channel, whatever the case may be. And so I think it's not always a company side thing. I've seen it happen on both sides. And so I think it's up to the comms professionals as well to bring those tried and true principles to every strategy and not rely on tactical fixes.
Hmm. Is there anything that you've maybe seen in the past work as far as getting them to maybe rethink it or to kind of like reassess the way that they're going about it?
Uh, I think what I've seen is you need really strong executive champions in order for things to change. So if you don't have, and so one of my corporate roles was with a big four firm. And with a lot of global firms, and I've worked mostly with global ones, there's a lot of communications. There's emails, there's intranets, et cetera, et cetera. So as an employee, you get overwhelmed by everything. And so during this particular role, we went through the process with the CEO as our executive champion. And the CEO said to us, we need to make sure that we're not sending 10 emails in a week or whatever the number was. He felt like we could communicate a lot more effectively without overwhelming people, because it wasn't just the internal communication that was going out from the comms team. You had HR sending out things like training. You had the risk people sending out their own communication, which was a little bit more technical. And so, as a single employee, depending on where you sat in the organization, you would be getting a lot of emails and a lot of notifications and maybe meeting invites and town halls, etc., that weren't necessarily helpful. And so I think where I've seen it work well is where there is alignment between the executive leadership team and the comms team about the problem that you're truly trying to address. And if that problem is, in this case, over communication or too much communication from too many different departments, how do we streamline? And that was the problem to be solved. I think if comms is the one trying to come up with the problems, I think they may not necessarily see the full picture. So that's why having that executive champion at the leadership team level really does help, because their job is to see the full picture of the organization. They see things that we may never have access to. And so getting that input and then saying, okay, but what's the real problem that we're trying to solve and how are we going to solve it? And I think that's where I've seen it work really well. And where I haven't seen it worked well is when people just say, let's pretty up the deck, or let's just do a newsletter because that will fix everything. And, it's like, instead of doing daily communication, let's just do weekly communication. I think that's not necessarily fixing the problem. It's just saying, let's try different things and see what works. But until you get to the root cause of a problem, you're never going to find the true solution.
Yeah. You may have kind of answered it here a little bit, but I wanted to kind of ask, what do you wish leaders understood about the time and discipline it takes to get comms right? You kept mentioning, the importance of leadership buy-in. So maybe how do we show them a little bit more of what they need to know to really understand the discipline?
Yeah. I think the first thing is we need to do a better job of educating um, who we are and what we do, and how what we do helps the organization. I've it's very rare for me to have seen comms professionals do that well. And I think some of that, and I've certainly noticed it in my own career, is we're so used to being the person behind the person that we forget that we are professionals in our own right, and that we have studied what we do, we have experience in communication, and we are true experts in communication. I don't think we necessarily always own our expertise. And that's an unfortunate piece because I don't think I've ever met someone from operations or finance who didn't own their expertise. So I think we sometimes forget that we are that because we are used to being in the background making things happen. So I think for me the first thing would be we need to make sure we're educating, and part of that is when whatever your communication strategy is, there needs to be somewhere in there about the communication strategy for the communication function and how you're communicating internally about what you do and why it matters and what impact you're having on the organization, particularly from a business goal perspective. So I think that's first thing. I think from the executive leadership team side, it is about understanding that comms cannot be a downstream function. It has to be something that is there from the start. And I know, there's always talk in communication communities about the seat at the table and being invited to the seat at the table. I think we already have a seat at the table. I think we need to learn to use that. And part of what I talked about a little bit earlier was around, how do we make sure that when we are in those executive leadership meetings, we are connecting the dots between what all of the executives are saying and then actually talking at a high level about the solution and maybe even just confirming the problem we're trying to solve. And so, I think we need to stop asking for that seat. We're already there. I think we need to make sure that we are proving to the executive leadership team that we are speaking their language. We are not just focused on the channels and the tactics, and that we're asking those smart questions. And I think from the executive leadership team side, in my experience, when communication does that, they listen. We, I think if we don't educate the executive leadership team about the value we bring, they might not necessarily see our value either. And I think that's true across the board that if you don't value yourself, why would someone else place value on the work that you do?
Hmm. I guess like if you could give executives one comms truth that they tend to underestimate, what would be an example of that for you?
Uh, Tom's truth would be, you I think I wrote this down so that I would remember it. And I'm like, where did I put it? So I think the one comms truth I would say is we are professionals and we know what we're talking about. So when we give advice, the advice is coming from experience and expertise and knowledge. And it may not necessarily be exactly what the team had in mind in terms of everyone thinks that they can communicate just like everyone thinks they can be a marketer. So it may not necessarily be how they would do it, but when comms provides advice and counsel, it's backed by their experience and expertise and knowledge of what works and what doesn't work.
Mm.
So I think that would be one truth about comms that I think is definitely leaders need to understand. They also need to understand that a single email is not going to change anybody's mind. And that's why the advice that we give is based on looking at everything holistically and coming up with an approach that we think will have the better impact long term, not necessarily just short term.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I wanted to maybe switch up a little bit and focus on some of the work that you've been doing lately. So we talked previously about your trust but verify concepts that you sort of discussed as part of your consultant work. And I wanted to maybe bring that to our listeners and let them to know a little bit more about what that looks like. So I was hoping if you could maybe give us a high level overview of how you describe the trust but verify system you use and the problem it was designed to solve.
So the trust by verify system was something that I started to develop as I was using generative AI more and more. And so what it is it's a practical framework for using AI responsibly in communication. so that you can be efficient and fast, but not compromise accuracy, ethics, or trust. It's built around these three principles of trust the intent of using AI, verify the output, and then document the process. And by following these principles, you're able to have a repeatable system so that every single time you are using AI to generate the first draft of a communication piece, a content piece, it helps save you time, because what you do is you spend majority of your time reviewing and editing. And the way that I designed the framework was it literally takes 15 minutes to implement because it just becomes part of your workflow. And I started developing this because when I was first using AI, you know, like everyone else, like you don't really understand the prompt engineering part of it. You didn't understand how specific you're supposed to get. And so, through trial and error, I started going like, okay, how do I make sure that when I enter something into one of the systems, the output that I get takes me maybe 70, 80% of the way there. And the rest of the 30% is me being the human in the loop of this workflow.
Mhm.
And it took me a while to kind of get there because I've always been a writer, but people used to joke that I have the brain of an editor because I literally have like a red pen mentally, where when I see things, I'm like going like red pen, cross this, do that. So, it kind of came from that perspective of having an editing mindset, but also kind of like thinking about what makes us human. And when you're doing communication, the writing piece is, I would say, the technical part of what we do. It's, if you're a comms person, you will be you write, and it's the words, it's the structure, it's the grammar, all those technical things. Those are all great. But amazing communication that truly is memorable, where people are feel like they've had a change of heart, or it drives a change in behavior. That kind of communication is really based on our human context and understanding and applying our human judgment to what we believe the audience will respond well to. And that's something that AI can't do. And so what, often if you put in a really in uh, like very general kind of prompt in ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, you will get a general response, but it doesn't necessarily understand the nuances of your organization. It doesn't understand your brand voice. And even the best prompts that have things like, here's the brand voice that we have, it still doesn't get it right. So what I started doing was I started documenting all of the ways that I was editing the output that I would get. And I then started, once I started documenting everything, when I remember kind of like looking back at it one day and going like, oh, you know what? Like, here's like these 4 easy steps that I can follow so that every time I get something from ChatGPT for whatever work I'm doing, I can just follow these 4 steps in order to make sure that anything that gets published has had some kind of human oversight over it. And that anything that gets published under my name, or under my oversight, isn't just something that a robot created, but rather it's something that it kind of recognizes the human insights and judgment and context that are needed.
Mhm.
And so for me, that was like the main thing in terms of how I approach the system. And then earlier this year, I started like documenting the system from the perspective of sharing it with others. And I've developed a course now which kind of takes people through that process itself and the framework. It kind of helps them think through how do they use AI in a way that can speed up the work that you do in communication, because we have a lot of work on our plates, and anything that can help us become efficient is always a good thing.
Mhm.
But also, how do you feel comfortable putting your name on something that goes out even though the first draft was generated by an AI system.
Right. I know that's all really interesting. And I know that you're also working on your PhD. And so I was kind of curious, as part of that work, like how, and the research that goes with it, how has that sort of shaped the way that you think about verification, knowledge, and human behavior in organizations?
Yeah. So one of the things with my doctoral research has been understanding how do you do research in a way that can be verified by someone, not you. And so part of research is understanding how do you create audit trails so that, if someone else was to check your work, they would still be able to follow the same steps that you followed and come up at the same point that you arrived at. And so a huge part of what I learned from my doctoral work was around the idea of creating audit trails for the work that I do and making sure that that audit trail can be used by anybody to verify my output. The other piece of it is what in our doctoral studies we call triangulation. And essentially, triangulation is looking at multiple sources in order to um, kind of validate the different points that you have. So as part of my research, let's say I'm doing interviews with different companies right now for my dissertation, you know, a lot of what interviews are people's own experiences. And so what triangulation helps you do is it allows you to then, look at other sources, whether it's, let's say, company reports, annual reports, blogs, maybe even like external things that have been written about a company, and start to see like, did what the person say to me, is it validated by other places and other sources of information? So when you're doing your doctoral studies, like you don't just blindly accept any one output because that's a biased approach. What you instead try to do is you validate the information that you have and the data that you've collected across multiple sources. So you triangulate that data, and then you document the entire process so that anyone is able to follow your steps. So, with the trust but verify system, I looked at what are those key elements of doing research and the process steps that you have to follow in order for it to meet the standards of a doctoral study. And I started to see that there was some commonality, and where there wasn't, I made an effort to apply those principles to the trust but verify system. And that was part of that repeatability where documenting the process creates an audit trail, and you document the metadata, you document what tool you used and what changes you made, so that if you were no longer at the company and someone was to say, hey, how do we know this to be true? Your audit trail as part of this repeatable system will show people, how do you know this to be true?
Hmm. I guess one way of thinking about this too is like the day-to-day aspect of it. And so what I was wondering is, how are you seeing AI impact or complicate internal communications right now with the way that all this is shifting?
I think I'm finding communication professionals, not all of them, but there's still a large community that is a little bit uncomfortable with using AI. And I think part of that is that many comms professionals pride themselves on their writing skills. And if AI can write as well as you can, it makes you start to wonder, what will the company even need me for? And so I'm finding like certain companies, you're having the executives tell different departments that they are supposed to use AI. And because executives are making these investments in different AI tools, and they expect the teams to use it. And so what the comms professional function needs to do is really think about how do you embed AI within your existing workflows, but more importantly, how do you use AI to make your work more efficient? And it frees up your time to focus on more strategic things. I know when I worked in corporate roles, my biggest challenge was I never had time to do any thinking. And I always used to be like, I need just some thinking time. I need a couple of hours where I can just look at everything and maybe start to noodle things in my head. I needed time to just connect the dots. And there was always so many requests coming in, and particularly where when you work in companies where the comms team is really small, there is so much extra work that comes your way that you're always busy, but then you're busy for the sake of being busy. And now we have this amazing tool that actually can help us think because it frees up our time to do so. So if we need to send out a communication or we need to edit an email, or we need to brainstorm ideas, we can use these tools to help us do that. And they do it much faster than we can. So it's something that took us 3 hours before, and if it can be done in 15, 20 minutes at 30 minutes, that means you now have those 2.5 hours to
Right.
focus on the strategic work. And it kind of goes back to a point that I was talking about earlier where understanding the root cause of a problem that communications asks to fix. If you don't have the thinking time to do that, then you will always just be doing tactics. But if you're using AI to do the tactical work, then you free up your time to do the thinking work. You can actually start to have a lot more engagement touch points with different departments across your organization to understand the root cause of the problem that we're trying to solve, and also start to embed yourself more in those culture conversations so that you can bring that human insight back to the output that you're getting from the AI. And now if you have a repeatable process, you're doing it a lot faster every single time. And then you're also just being transparent about it. I don't think there's any need to hide the fact that you're using AI to help you facilitate your workflows, because that is an expectation now in most organizations that are making investment in AIs, that we're making this investment. You need to think through your entire workflow, and technology can't fix a broken workflow. So you need to think through that entire workflow and see where does AI fit in and where does the human fit into that workflow.
Hmm. And I guess speaking of the workflow side of things, and when we think about sort of like navigating these ecosystems that we're getting now as a result of all of this, do you have, like, as part of that trust but verify system or sort of part of your work, do you have sort of a core checks and questions approach to how you verify any of the content that you're getting from AI? I'm just kind of wondering like how someone can build a verification routine into their workflow.
Yeah. So when I developed the framework, I looked at what are the four main steps that I follow. And the first was you have to trust the tool. So when you're using AI with an informed confidence of what it can do well and what it can't, then you're starting with realistic expectations. The next is to verify the output. And in this one, I created a series of checklists and templates that people can use to systematically review the content. So you're reviewing it for things like, is it factual? Is the tonality of the content good enough, or does it need to be changed based on our organization and our culture? You're looking at also the structure. Sometimes with AI, you get these monotonous sentences. And as humans, we have a very varied way of talking, a varied way of writing. So you want to start to think about the structure from that perspective. And, the AI stuff is grammatically, technically correct, but it's not always the most interesting. And then you start to look at the logical integrity. So part of my system kind of takes people through that checklist of what do you look for so that you can catch the errors before they cause harm. And then once you've done that, then you can assess the fit. So, this is very specific to every organization. Like you check, does this align with our brand voice? the audience that we're talking to, how does this meet their needs? What's the communication context? So this allows you to kind of look at the relevance and the resonance of the piece. And then you start to refine it. And that's where that human in the loop piece comes in. You add your unique judgment. Maybe there's a word choice that, yes, it can work, but is there a better one? Are we taking into account the way the person that we're communicating on behalf of talks, things that they may say and never say? And so we bring our own insights and the tone to elevate it from something that's generic to strategic. So, as an example, I remember working on this comms once, and I'm a bit of a word geek. So, I like to use sometimes big words when they're not needed. And I think just based on how I talk, I tend to do a lot of double negatives even in my writing. And I remember the person read the piece and they were like, "Why are we using a double negative when we can just say it in a positive way?" And to me, it sounded very elegant being written in this, and not just elegant, it sounded very sophisticated. And I was like very proud of it. But it made me realize that just because that's how I would do it, it doesn't necessarily mean that was the right way for that person, because their way of talking and communicating was to keep it simple. My way can sometimes be a little bit more. I like to say I like to take people on a journey before they get to their destination. So sometimes my writing is very much driven by storytelling, and part of it is because I also write fiction, so I like to take that long, the scenic route. And for this person, that wasn't necessarily the right way. So I think that's where you really start to think about, how do you make it yours? And so part of the what I've developed is definitely about giving people exactly those checklists so that they can literally take the entire workflow that I've developed with all of those checklists, templates, etc., and insert it into their own. They might need to tweak a couple of things based on their organizational culture if they have like specific in workflows, like it has to go through risk or legal or whatever it is. But I think it still takes them most of the way there, which can be a huge time saver.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of almost, a rhetorical question, but are there any kinds of communications or knowledge tasks where that verification, should never be skipped, or is there anything where the automation you could safely lean on more heavily and trust it more? Have you seen anything like that you've sort of noticed?
Yeah, I I think in an ideal world you should never skip it.
Right.
And I think because at the end of the day, you're sending something on and you are accountable for it. So
Mhm.
if you haven't done any verification whatsoever, and part of what I talk about in the framework is certain communications you may only do step 1 and 2. In other cases, you need to follow all 4 steps. It is contextual, but if you're doing crisis communication or change communication, I don't think you should skip any step whatsoever, because there's a huge financial sometimes and business impact that can cause a blowback on the comms function if you've skipped the verification checkpoints.
Right.
I think certain things like, let's say you have an annual enrollment campaign for your insurance program. It happens every year. This it's the same communication roughly. And I think in those situations, you might tweak things here and there, and you might just do a check for brand voice and tone and what have you, but you may not necessarily need to check anything else because it's the same every year. So I think there are those scenarios, and I map some of them out in the course. But definitely think about where something has, this idea of um, low impact, high value, or high impact, low value, those kind of like matrices where
Mhm.
you apply that risk management approach to communication. I think that risk management approach can really help you identify when it's really important to go through that entire verification process versus where it's not. But definitely high stakes situations, like you should never send anything on that you don't feel like you've looked at it and verified it and feel confident that you're good putting your name behind it.
Hmm. You mentioned change management there before a moment ago, and so it sort of goes along with this topic because you're sort of thinking about introducing this as a new way of working almost within organizations. And I was wondering, like, how do you help leadership and teams align on what good looks like when AI is sort of in the communication workflow?
I think first thing you want to do is kind of like go back to those strategic principles of what good communication is.
Hmm.
Because at the end of the day, good communication is about understanding your audience's needs, understanding the business goals, and trying to align the two and making sure you take people along on that journey, particularly when it comes to change. So I think when it comes to good AI, like it should sound like a human wrote it.
Hmm.
That's why the editing is so important. Like a lot of people complain about the roboticness of AI content. Some of it is about the prompting. My experience with prompts has always been it's just like writing a creative brief. And I remember like when I used to get creative briefs from my clients, like sometimes for a press release, the key message would literally be this one line. And I would be like, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be writing here. So, it's like the more precise a creative brief was and the more well thought out it was, the better I was able to do my job so that I could meet my stakeholders' expectations. So I think with AI is the same thing. You can have a really great prompt by being super precise and thinking just like how you would with when you write a creative brief and or even how you give instructions to a junior team member. If you have an intern on your team, they don't really know what they're supposed to be doing. So your job as the person that's guiding them, that's mentoring them, is to actually help them think through what they need to be doing. So the more precise and specific you are about how you help them understand things, the better they're able to give you back something. And I think with AI, it's no different. So I think with good AI, it's about having something that's 80% of the way there. And then the rest of the 20% is your opportunity as a comms professional to make it sound human and not get too fussed about, being grammatically technically correct and things like that, because humans are not grammatically technically correct. And I think it's really important to start to think about the voice of the person that you're writing on behalf of or the brand that you're representing. And that's where you can actually show executives and say, this is, and you can sometimes, and I've done this in trainings where I've shown a client, here's the output from AI, here's the output after it went through the editing. And it kind of shows them that you didn't like edit 50% of it or even revoke the whole thing, because then what's the point of using AI? It's more about helping them identify here's some things that can come across awkward
Hmm.
from the perspective of the person receiving it. And, if you are in the communication function, you need to understand your stakeholders. And whether those stakeholders are internal or external, it doesn't matter. You need to understand them. So when you are showing the executives what's good AI, good communication, you do it from the perspective of that stakeholder to say, if XYZ were to receive this communication, they are more likely to react in this way versus that way. And I think that's where that expertise comes in that I talked about earlier, having the experience, knowledge, and expertise in communication and all of the disciplines that exist within it, like stakeholder engagement, change management, etc., to be able to say, here's how a communication will be received. Here's the likely impact of it, because we can't guarantee anything and we don't have a crystal ball to tell the future. But based on our knowledge and experience and our expertise, we can make an educated guess about how something will be received and have a plan to address the feedback that comes in. So I think that's kind of like how you do it. And I think it all goes back to continuous education for ourselves, so that we understand how the landscape of communication is changing, how tools like AI are facilitating that change, and how they're also going to change fundamentally what we do on a day in, day out basis. Because the more we integrate AI into our workflow, the expectation will be that we are doing more outputs. But I think we can also use that as a way to pause and say, yes, we can do more outputs from a tactical perspective, but let's always make sure that we're mapping everything back to the strategy itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned about how AI is always constantly changing, re-educating, and the thing I've been doing lately is I've been using AI to give me prompts. So I ask it to write a prompt for it, which I find is it's pretty wild to think that that's where we're at now. But yeah, it's just constantly shifting, right? I guess if we just to kind of close out the topic of change management a little bit, I always like to ask people, like, what do you, when you think about it, what's one thing that teams consistently overlook? I always want to kind of get the tips and tricks from people who've been doing it for a long time, right?
From a change management perspective,
Yeah, exactly.
I think they overlook the silent majority.
Mm.
It's I worked on this change project a couple of years ago with a client, and they had all of these slide decks and with everything mapped out and everything, but I don't think they actually acknowledge that there might be a silent majority. And how do you engage? Because you can't engage them. Some of them don't want to be engaged. So it's like, how do you find a way in? And sometimes it's not you doing it, but finding those internal advocates or champions who can do it for you. But we always seem to forget about them, because when people are silent, you think everything is okay, and that's not always the case.
Mhm.
There's a lot of like those water cooler conversations happening on Teams chats and what have you. So it's kind of one of those things that I think we do overlook, and maybe we need to spend a little bit more time thinking those through, because we love our advocates, and the detractors, the ones that will never change their mind, we ignore them because we know that no matter what we do, we will never change their mind. So all we can do is mitigate the impact that they can have. But there's this vast number of people in between. And I've seen that in branding work as well. Like when you do brand work, you focus on like net promoter scores. And it's always those ones in the middle where you're like, okay, like they always like answer neutral, right? It's like the neutral doesn't actually help you. And so you end up focusing on the extremes. And I don't think that's helpful. So you always have to start to think about, what about the people we haven't heard from? Or maybe we've heard from them, but they've been on the fence and we don't know why. So we need to figure out, how do we actually get feedback from them?
Mhm.
And it will vary how you get feedback based on your organization and the project itself.
Right.
But I do think we need to start to think about the silent majority a lot more than we do currently.
Mhm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting. I always sort of go when we go through a change project, introducing a platform and that. I'll normally mention to the person, like you can either start with the cheerleaders or you can kind of start with the people who are going to be the most resistant, and
Mhm,
you build momentum either way. It just sort of depends on how you want to kind of tackle that. And
mhm.
it's curious too, because most people will sort of click right then and go, okay, I know which one I need to focus on, right? But that's another one that I'll bring up is, what about the middle, right? And kind of getting a sense of what that looks like. So,
Yeah. And I do think we underestimate the importance of team leaders and managers
of course,
in,
yeah.
in helping us do that. And, some organizations do a better job of engaging managers, but I think they forget that managers are also employees.
Mhm.
And, there's almost like this trickle down effect where they're like, oh, well, let's just ask all the people managers to talk to their teams. But the reality is, those managers have the same concerns as their team.
Sure.
And they're trying to put on this brave face, like, I'm the manager, I need to talk the corporate line. But I think we forget that they are employees,
Mhm.
and they have uncertainty, they have questions. So I think when we engage managers, we need to do it in that open, transparent way, so that we address their questions first and their concerns first,
Mhm.
and make sure that when we talk to them, it's from the perspective of them as employees first, managers second.
Mhm.
Because if we feel like, if we do a really good job of addressing their concerns first, I think we can turn them into the people who will go down to their team and say, you know what, like, yeah, I heard what they said and I feel really confident about it. Rather than here's the key messages that I've been given and I'm just gonna like
Yeah.
tell you what corporate is telling me to tell you.
Right, right. Yeah, it's always a case of trying to make sure you've won them over and they understand and they see the vision before, giving them that request or seeing if they're going to turn around and do it for you, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah.
um, kind of keeping on this line of practical advice, what's one piece of comms advice you give clients that seems simple but is surprisingly hard for organizations to do?
Uh, so I think what's hard for them is keeping it simple.
Yeah.
It and I shared my example of the double negatives and what have you, right? And it's hard for me too at times. Like I do tend to overthink and I complicate things. But I think the one piece of advice I've always given is to keep it simple because when you try to do too much, you end up doing none of it.
Mhm.
Or you have this beautiful campaign or program that you launch and then it goes flat because it was just too complicated. So, I always like to tell clients to keep it simple. Like even when I work on any kind of campaign with clients, I always go back to what are we trying to achieve and why are we trying to achieve it?
Mhm.
And if we can do one to two things really well to help drive those business objectives, then we've done our job well. And, it's not to say that you can't do those other things later because you can. It's just that when you are launching something new, when you're coming up with an initiative or you're working on this large project, you do want to take it in steps. And that I will say that that's another lesson for my doctoral studies. Like our program head always says like, it's a marathon, it's a journey. He always says like you need to enjoy the journey of being a doctoral student. And a lot of what he means is you take things step by step.
Sure.
So, you don't try to do everything all at once. You don't try to create like these big complicated research questions that you will never solve in your lifetime. Like my original research question, everyone kept telling me, yeah, you'll never, like, they were like, do you plan to graduate? Because if you do, then you won't be able to with this research question.
Mm.
So I had to strip things back in order to make it simple. And part of keeping things simple is creating these guardrails. And the guardrails kind of guide you to say any kind of like, shiny object syndrome, new ideas, whatever they come in, you evaluate it around those guardrails of what are we trying to achieve? How will this help us drive our business objectives? And if the answer is you're not sure about either of them, then you put it outside the guardrail to look at another time. But absolutely keep it simple. As human beings, we are inundated with information. There's literally information overload. We don't have the attention spans we used to because there's too much coming at us. So if we do keep it simple, we're more likely to cut through that noise than rather than trying to complicate it and then not having an impact at all.
Hmm. Well, in the vein of keeping it simple, maybe another question is if an organization could only fix one communications issue this year, where do you think they should start?
Uh, they definitely need to address the impact of AI on the future of work. I remember sitting like when I was in that big four, like they used to do a lot of work on future of work.
Mhm.
And I don't think like, 6, 7 years ago, even 8 years ago, nobody was actually talking about AI as part of the future of work. We were talking about the flexibility. We were talking about designing work that meets our needs, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't remember, anyone ever talking about the massive impact that AI would have on the actual work that we do, but more importantly, what the workplace will look like when there are literally levels of jobs disappearing. And so I think the communication issue that companies really need to address is, what does this look like? Like, what does the workplace look like in the future? What does it mean from a culture perspective? And particularly when you have layoffs and the layoff announcements are, we're cutting 20% of our workforce. Those 20% are people, and they're people with real lives who, I've known people who've been laid off, and there's a mental recovery process that you go through, because a part of you is like, but I was doing amazing work. Like, why am I being let go? And so I think we can't discount that human element of what happens when the workplace fundamentally shifts.
Mhm.
So communication needs to be part of those conversations. They can't just be the afterthought with, hey, we need to send out an email, work with HR on what we're going to say.
Yeah.
You can't message your way out of this, something like this. You really have to be thoughtful and really think about the impact on the culture and on the people around you. And sometimes with the comms function is also people who you work with that may be let go, or maybe those jobs will no longer exist. So you as the individual, start to think about, well, what am I going to be next? So, I think we really need to start to think about, how do we address these concerns, and very real concerns that people have about the value that they place on themselves as professionals, and how AI is fundamentally changing that. Yes, it's making things more efficient, but then we need to start to think about, what is the work that humans do that AI can help facilitate but will never take over.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it's a lot of change going on right now. I suppose aside from like the trust but verify concepts we've discussed today, are there any other maybe tools or frameworks or exercises you wish that more teams used generally as part of their strategy and work?
It's just this is an oldie, but I wish we used the RACI model
Mhm.
a lot more. I don't know. I think I've only ever worked in one comms team where they used it, and that was because I forced them to use it. But I'm very surprised that we don't use enough of that. Like, I mean, as I said, like, it's an oldie but goldie, but it's so important because it really does help clarify roles and responsibilities.
Yep.
When we've used it, it's really helped make everything we do move a lot faster, and with a lot more clarity than we had before.
Yep.
And so I think we should definitely look at the tools that have been around for a long time, like the frameworks that have been around and have worked really well, and make sure that we as comms professionals are actually applying them, because a lot of other departments do, and they are better for it. I think we can adopt them too and be better for it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I always bring it up at the beginning of the implementations that we do, and
Mhm.
sometimes I'll catch people off guard. And it is a case that it isn't broadly used everywhere all the time, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, but it's like, I kind of came up in the finance part of things because I used to do financial communication, and it's used quite widely over there because there's so many moving parts.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's a lot of those, but that's the one I always go like, oh, we don't have a RASI model for our team. We need to have one.
Right. Yeah. So, along with the work that you've been doing around your PhD, the other thing that you've done recently is created the ideas engine. So, I was wondering maybe if you wanted to take a little bit of time to explain what that looked like, and sort of like why you built it and what the gap was that you were trying to fill.
Yeah. So the Ideas Engine is an AI powered strategy platform for marketing teams to develop thought leadership strategies and do it faster. And I've been thinking about it for, I think, over a year. I remember I have this like a 100-page document that outlined my entire thinking around what I wanted to do. And then a few months ago, I did an AI coding boot camp. And part of the boot camp was, you get to build your app in 30 days, and I did. And so with the Ideas Engine, I always had this thought that, the work that I do, could it be commoditized in some way? And I do a lot of work in thought leadership. I have my own processes of how I follow things. I have my own questions that I ask clients at the start of every engagement. And so I wanted to take that because my experience has been there's a lot of companies that want to do thought leadership in the right way. Like they want to have insights on the industry issues that matter to their customers. They just don't have the time. And thought leadership, unfortunately, always ends up being a side of the desk kind of work for somebody who's already overworked. And so I asked myself, like, if you could if you could have a system that allows you to answer some questions for like kind of like filling out a creative brief, and then you pressed enter and the AI created something that was very specific to the questions you answered and did it, like, and tested my system and it literally took 20 minutes start to finish. And you have a plan that's actually very good. I created fake companies as part of my testing. I did it for my own business as well. And so with the ideas engine, the goal is to help companies, marketing teams, marketing consultants who want to do thought leadership but don't have time, help them do it faster by answering a series of questions. And part of the way that I've built the app is looking at what are the key friction points. And the key friction points is you don't have a strategy, so it's chaotic do it yourself planning. It's like an executive comes and says, we need to do a blog on this topic because our competitor is writing about it. And so you're always like spread thin, but the ideas engine helps you just create that strategy fast and keeps you focused. And then you can take that strategy and the content pillars and put it into the system to create your own content plan with a calendar for 90 days so that you have everything mapped out to the marketing funnel. And it will suggest things like, here's the piece that you can use for awareness. Here's the one you can use for bottom of the funnel. And then the third element of it is the executive visibility. So creating executive POV plans so that when you have executives and you want them to be out in the market talking, what do they need to talk about? And so, you fill out again those questions about the executives. What is their hot take on the topic? What do you want them to do for the business? You answer those questions and you get a 90-day visibility plan that you can just implement depending on sources. Because my experience is we have a lot of tools that help us do the tactics, but the strategy tools, particularly that are very specific to the work that we do, are rare. And if they exist, they can be very generic. So with the ideas engine, I was trying to solve this problem of having something that allows you to create strategy fast, but make it very specific to your business goals so that when you start to implement it, it actually does make an impact.
Oh, that's great. We're just about at time here, so I wanted to maybe close out here. And so the last question is, what's one principle or philosophy you try to live by in your work?
Audience first. I think that's for me has always been the most important thing. Whenever I start an engagement with any client, my first question to them is, who are we talking to and what do we know about them? Because if we don't know who we're talking to, the best and most beautiful looking plan will not fix the problem. So that is something that I've always stuck by. And it's something that I feel it's really important because I can always tell when a client is not ready, when they can't answer that question, or they have very generic, like when someone says, we want to talk to everybody. Everybody is not going to be buying your product or service or engaging with you. So for me, that's the philosophy I live by is understand your audience, who they are, what do we know about them, and everything else will flow from there.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for joining. And so that's it for today's episode of Unmuted. If you found yourself nodding along over the course of the conversation, go ahead and rate, review, and follow, and pass it along to the leader you know who still believes common sense is a communication and knowledge management strategy. Let's keep raising the bar together, everyone.